It's the 20th of January. How many of you made New Year's resolutions? How many of you have managed to keep that resolution so far? I'll be honest, I've never been a resolution kind of person, but there is something in me that as we reach December 31 and we move into January 1, that it's kind of like God is saying to me, Bob, I wiped the slate clean for you. You can start fresh tomorrow. And that's an exhilarating kind of feeling to have. A nice light snowfall like what we have outside turns all of this brown-gray topography white and clean for a little while. I think in all of us there's something maybe just a little bit innate about that sense of being able to start over again, to start fresh and new and clean. My wife and I made it to the Y for some exercise this week, and we were struck by how full the parking lot was. And I'll blame it all on her. She said, but by the end of February or March, it won't be as bad. The building is not going to be quite as busy. And I think a lot of that has to do with this sense of making resolutions, deciding that we want to do something new, better, more right. But it's really hard to maintain that. I'm struck, and I think there are some times that when we go to the Bible and we try to find what God is trying to tell us, we look at the words, and that's an important part of it. But I've been struck on occasion by just finding stories and seeing where they're located in relationship to other things. And I think often there's a message in that as well. I made a big deal out of this being the next to the last chapter of the whole Bible. Now, in the first two chapters of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, we have not one, but two creation stories. And it's always struck me really kind of powerfully that here we are, next to last chapter of the Bible, and what do we have? We've got another creation story. For those who know me a little better, they know that I read mystery novels. Some even might call them trashy mystery novels. I haven't read too many deep things since I retired. That was what I kind of understood to be a perk of retirement. But one thing about mystery novels, by the time you get to this point in the book, you kind of say, I figured it out. Or, if the author is really pretty good, you're still not too sure about how it's going to turn out in the end. I would imagine that there are not very many people that would get to the end of the Bible and think that, we've got a new beginning here. We're starting over. We're starting fresh. We're starting new. And the other piece of that is it's not just a little bit of newness. If you look at the words, the new creation is totally different than the one we lived in all of our lives. And the key to that comes from the line, and the sea was no more. The major portion of our creation is oceans. And that's how dramatic the newness is. We're kind of sucked in by our culture, what I call incremental newness. And I think it plays out in much of the advertising and marketing process that we're involved in the world, These novels and mystery novels that I read, if I go to the bookstore and I'll see a book on the shelf and I say, oh, I don't remember reading that before, it's because they put a new cover on it. Or new and improved Tide. New and improved oatmeal. I'm of an age when I can remember when we walked through the aisles of the grocery store and your choice was oatmeal or dry cereal. Now you have 14 choices of oatmeal and a whole aisle full of dry cereal to choose from. We think in terms of change as it comes a little bit at a time. We work our way into things slowly. We don't want to change too much, too fast, because our bodies and our lives might not be able to adjust to it. But we've got to be mindful of the fact that we worship a God who talks about change in terms of what the business world a few years ago was calling paradigm shifts. I have to admit, I got enamored by that, so much so that one of the pastors in my presbytery, I never did find out who, put this cartoon on the door to my office. And it was a picture of a new chick that had just cracked its way out of the shell of the egg. And the chick says, "Oh, paradigm shift." Talk about butterflies coming out of the cocoon. They went in as a caterpillar, they came out with wings. That's change at a level that we don't experience very often in our lives. Some of the places, I think, are when a young couple get married and they have their first child. Major shift in life. But for the most part, we like to take it a baby step at a time. If you read and study change theory, that's the way they lead you through change theory, a little bit at a time. But we're talking about a God who can take your heart and turn it around. We're talking about a God who can take your life and point it in an entirely new direction. We're talking about a God who is proclaiming to his people even then that, for you I've been a God way off up there somewhere. But in this new creation, I'm right here with you. I think something related to that is that we also have a tendency in our minds to see this new creation as something that's going to be way off down there. But it's really more like Lisa was sharing with the children this morning. It's here and now. We're in that new creation. We're called to be God's new people, and we're called to live out a life as though we are in heaven. But all of that said, change doesn't come easier. Maybe I'm making excuses for myself, but as I get older and older, I discover that change seems to be, on the one hand, harder and harder, and on the other hand, it's like, well, I've seen this all before. It's going to turn out all right in the end. but I think that Lisa really nailed it with the children's time. We need to be looking around us and seeing where people are being treated unfairly. And then do something about it. We need to be looking inside ourselves and checking out where I take for granted privileges that I assume are mine, but maybe somebody else doesn't have them. Lisa talked about Martin Luther King and so much of what was going on in those 60s around racial privilege and lack of privilege. I probably still struggle more in my life today with male and female issues. I take for granted a lot of what is mine because I was lucky enough to be born a man. Read this cute little thing on Facebook. I probably spend far too much time reading on Facebook, but you find some good stuff now and then, and I like to think that I put some good stuff out there now and then. But this guy who works an 8-hour day every day, he's a management level person, prays to God that he could be switched in places with his wife, because she doesn't have any idea how hard he works all day. So God grants him that request. And long story short, he discovers that he would like to go back to being a man and working for 8 hours a day rather than from waking to sleeping, and all the work that comes along with being the mother of the household. You know, when we're in those positions of privilege, it's easy to assume that they're God-given rights. God is still leading us into the new heaven and the new earth. Another thing about the Bible is that if we read it, having read this chapter 21, and if we go back and read it from that perspective, we will discover that God has all the time been dragging his people into that new tomorrow. And they've come along kicking and screaming. And the only times that God really encourages us to look back, you know, I look back and think, oh, high school, it'd be so good to go back to high school. I look back in college, it'd be so good to go back to those college days and the parties we had. I forget about the papers I had to write and the tests I had to take. That selective memory. But the God that we worship says, when you look back for the purpose of being reminded of who brought you from there to now. Don't look back longing to go back to a different day and a different time that will be no more. I think I've had that kind of pressed on me pretty hard in the last 2 or 3 months. I retired at the end of 2013 as an executive presbyter. And what I can tell you with great confidence today is that I had made the adjustment really pretty good. Because having gone back to doing that work again, even though it's part-time and temporary, I've learned very quickly that it's not the way it used to be before I retired. It's a new time, it's a new day, new challenges, and a new map to be drawn. And maybe the greatest assurance in all that is not, number one, let's look for the places where we can right wrong and make things fairer. In the Bible, the same word for righteous in other parts of Scripture is translated as justice. So in our ancient tradition, justice and righteousness are the same thing. But we look back, or we look out there, and we find places that we can make things more fair for everybody. But the other part of it is, let's remember that it's God who brought us from back there to here, and it is the God that we worship this morning that's going to take us from here into tomorrow. Let's trust that. If our efforts are trying to maintain what has been, we're probably listening to the wrong God. Amen.